Hi everyone, my name is Shauna Downs and I'm an assistant professor from the Rutgers School of Public Health. I'm going to give just a very brief talk that will hopefully lay some of the foundation for our learning lab on the food environment. The title of my talk is Food Environment Typology, Wild, Cultivated, and Built Food Environments. And this is really a collaborative effort with both Dr. Selena Ahmed and also Anna Herforth. So I thought I'd just start by talking a little bit about food environment types, and obviously Anna has already gone over this a little bit. I hope you've watched her video. But basically, the food environment literature has really been focused on high-income countries. So when you look at the photos on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see the types of food environments that we often see in high-income countries. And although the food environments in low and middle income countries are changing quite dramatically, there hasn't been a lot of research that has been focused on examining them and looking at how you might be able to intervene within them to promote healthy diets. And when we're thinking about low and middle income country food environments, we really need to go beyond thinking about the built food environment or the modern retail food environment, which is a lot of the work that has already been done in high income countries, and then trying to use that work and apply it to the low and middle income country context. Although there is still the built environment, and that is a huge component of the food environment, we have to go beyond thinking in that sense and think about the other types of food environments that people interface with. And that's the premise of this talk, is to sort of go over what those different food environment types are. So as I mentioned, food environment research is slowly increasing in low and middle income countries. This is from Chris Turner's paper that was published last year, and it's looking at, this graph is looking at the publications coming from low and middle income countries over time. And you can see that that's obviously increasing, but it's still quite low. And so when you look at food environment literature, the majority is still coming from high income countries. And the majority of that is really focused on the built retail environment. So there needs to be more broad thinking around the food environment and what that entails when we're thinking about low and middle income countries. So myself and Selena and Anna have been talking a lot over the past couple years about what the food environment types are. And the thinking around this paper that I'm going to talk about in this talk really developed from some of the early work that Selena and Anna did looking at the food environment. So this was actually in one of the ANH Academy blogs. So they published this blog that was called Missing Wild and Cultivated Environments in Food Environment Measures. So what we did is we took sort of this preliminary work that they did as part of this blog and tried to flesh it out a little bit more and think about what are all the different types of food environments that people have access to and interface with, particularly in the developing world. And to do this, we really focused on using both the existing food environment literature, but also it was really informed through a lot of our work that we've done over the past several years in low and middle income country context, trying to characterize food environments. So we've all had a lot of field experience in different settings, looking at what types of food environments people have access to, and then the elements of the food environment within those types. And this really led to our paper that was just published about a month ago or so now, that's essentially created what we call a food environment typology. And so this paper was published in Foods, and it was also part of the reading for this learning lab. And so the remaining of the talk, I'm really just going to go over some of the key points from the paper that really relate to this learning lab and how we might think about both characterizing food environments and measuring them. So this is the food environment typology that we developed as part of this work. This is really, as I mentioned, conceptual, based on both our field experience, but also on existing literature. And basically, we characterize the food environment types as two main overarching types. So you have the natural food environment, which entails both the wild food environment as well as cultivated. So The wild food environment includes things like forests and jungles, open pastures, natural lakes, seas, ponds, and rivers. And the cultivated includes things like farmers' fields, orchards, gardens, kitchen gardens or home gardens, pastures, and also aquaculture. And then you have the built food environment. And this really relates to a lot of the work that has been done, particularly in high-income countries, related to the formal built environment or the formal market food environment, but also the informal market. So for the formal market, we have things like hypermarkets, retailers, restaurants, farmers markets. But then within the informal market, we have things like wet markets, a lot of street vendors, mobile vendors, and kiosks or boutiques, which you often see sometimes in rural villages in Africa or Asia, as an example. So the idea of this was really to think about what are all the different ways in which people living in the developing world, but also beyond the developing world, so also in high-income countries, access food. What are those access points? And so that was the idea of this work. And this is just to give you a little bit of context of what we mean when we're talking about natural and built food environments. So this is pictures from some of the work that I've done in India with my colleague, Dr. Supana Ghosh Jarath at the Public Health Foundation of India. And you can see this is really looking at the natural food environment. So you have on the left some of the different grains that are being cultivated within farmers' fields. But then you also have the wild food environment. So in the middle picture, this is from a pond that was near to the community we were working in, and then just trees that were in the jungle alongside of the village. So these are all the different places that people access food in that specific food environment. And then if you look again from India, these are pictures of the built food environment. So you see the market food environment, it's sort of like a wet market. And then on the right, you have sort of one of these kiosks or boutiques that you often see in many rural areas. So the reason why I think it's important to think about the different food environment types is because the types of food environments that people are having access to is really shifting in the developing world. So this figure is from our paper, and it's looking at the food environment transition. So across the top, as you sort of go through Barry Popkin's nutrition transition, or something along the same lines as the nutrition transition patterns, you see this shift in the types of food environments that people are accessing. So starting with the hunter-gatherer societies, obviously they're really interfacing with wild food environments. And then you have early agrarian subsistence societies where you have the wild and cultivated food environments. And then as you go along, you might add the informal food environment. And then there tends to be a shift towards the combination of informal and formal built food environments. And then when you get to a place like, for example, the US, which is where I'm based, it's very much formal market built environments that we interface with as consumers. As part of this figure, we also conceptualize this 6 pattern that is not part of Barry Popkin's nutrition transition. And that's really shifting towards more sustainable diets and planetary health. And so we sort of foresee that there will be a shift as consumers and society more broadly become more aware about the concerns related to sustainability and want to consume a more sustainable diet. There might be this shift towards more cultivation. And in some ways, you can actually see that now as it relates to COVID-19 and some of the shifts that we're seeing. Definitely in high-income countries like the US, there's been an increase in people wanting to grow some of their own foods. So in terms of what this means to have these different food environment types, I think one of the things that's really critical is that it informs what we have to do in terms of measuring them. So we know from Anna's talk, this is another figure from our paper that's looking at the different elements of the food environment. So you have promotion, affordability, availability, quality, convenience, and then we've included sustainability properties within our definition of the food environment. So if we're going to characterize food environments with the view to then identifying how we might intervene to improve diets, but also to measure how they transition over time, we need methods that are measuring the different types of food environments that people interface with. And so as part of this talk, I'm not going to go into detail on it, but this is just one little snippet from our paper. And it's looking at the different elements of the food environment, so availability, affordability, convenience, etc. And so we have a table that includes a list of all the tools that measure different components of the food environment. And then on top of that, we've looked at whether or not they're objective or perceived measures of the food environment. Because if we go back to this figure here and to Anna's talk, where she's talking about the food environment being this external component, and then the individual factors are the ones that kind of interact with the food environment. So for example, my personal ability to be able to access a certain market obviously influences whether or not I'm going to go there to purchase the foods that I want to purchase. So in terms of measuring the food environment, we think that it's pretty critical to measure not only the external food environment, but also these individual factors that influence how consumers interface with the food environment. Because definitely based on the work that I've done in several countries now, the perceived food environment is really critical in terms of determining how people interface with their food environment. The way they perceive that environment is very important. So there's a need to measure both objectively the food environment, but also the perceptions related to the food environment. And so this table that's included in our paper really looks at all these different tools that can be used to measure the different components of the food environment, and then whether or not they're perceived or objectively measuring the food environment. And I really think it's critical when we're thinking about measuring the food environment to measure both in order to really be able to design interventions that are tailored to the needs of consumers and the way that they interface with their food environment. So just to finish up with some key messages, there is a need to examine the different food environment types where people source food. Obviously, that's increasingly important in the developing world, and also to understand how those types of food environments might be shifting over time. The food environment transitions underlie the nutrition transition, and it's sort of a driver of what is going on in terms of diets and nutrition. And as this transition takes place, there seems to be more reliance on the built food environment, and the quality of the foods within them are sometimes mixed. Sometimes you might have higher amounts of ultra-processed foods, but you could also have potentially safer foods in some regard. There's also this change in terms of access to diverse foods when we're thinking about the built food environment. There tends to be more diversity within those food environments. And that's why it's really important when we're measuring food environments and trying to characterize the food environments in the settings in which we're working, that we look at all these different types and try to measure these different types to get a better sense of what are all the sources of food that people have access to. And then lastly, interventions aimed at improving diets need to target these various food environments. And that's really important. And priority areas for interventions are going to shift as countries move along the food environment transition, and the types of food environments that they have access to change. So on that note, I will finish up, and I look forward to seeing you all at the Learning Lab. Thank you.